She died with over $100 million in the bank. That's roughly $2.5 billion in today's money. But when Hetty Greene collapsed from a stroke in 1916, she was wearing the same black dress she'd worn for decades, so filthy and worn that it barely held together. The hem was frayed. The fabric was stiff with years of dirt. She hadn't paid to have it cleaned in years. This wasn't a woman who couldn't afford better. Hetty Greene could have bought entire city blocks in Manhattan. She could have owned fleets of yachts. She could have dripped in diamonds every single day. But instead, she chose to live in unheated apartments, eat cold oatmeal because heating it cost money, and move from boarding house to avoid establishing legal residence and paying taxes. Her son lost his leg because she was too cheap to pay for proper medical care. She fought her own family in court for decades over inheritance. She once spent an entire night searching through her carriage with a lantern because she'd lost a 2-cent stamp. Hetty Greene was the richest woman in America, and she was absolutely, completely, pathologically terrified of spending a single dollar. This is the story of how money didn't buy freedom. It bought a prison. A prison where the warden and the prisoner were the same person. A prison built not from bars, but from fear, obsession, and a twisted relationship with wealth that would destroy everything she touched. Some called her the Witch of Wall Street. Others called her a financial genius. But the truth is far more disturbing than either label suggests. Because Hetty Greene's story isn't just about being cheap. It's about what happens when the accumulation of money becomes more important than life itself. Let's start at the beginning. Because to understand how Hetty became the woman who would let her own child suffer rather than pay a doctor, you have to understand where she came from. And what you'll discover is that her story was written long before she ever made her first million. Henrietta Howland Robinson was born on November 21st, 1834, in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Not in poverty, not in the middle class. She was born into serious generational wealth. Her father, Edward Mott Robinson, wasn't just comfortable. He was one of the wealthiest men in New Bedford, a city that was, at the time, one of the richest per capita in the entire world. Why? Whaling. New Bedford was the whaling capital of America, and the Robinson family had made their fortune in whale oil, shipping, and trade. By the time Hetty was born, her father's wealth was estimated at over $10 million. That's more than $300 million in today's dollars. The family owned a fleet of whaling ships. They had investments in railroads, real estate, and banks. The Robinson name meant something in New Bedford. It meant power. It meant influence. It meant money. But here's the thing about Hetty's childhood. Despite all that wealth, it was cold. Emotionally cold. Physically cold. Her mother, Abby Howland Robinson, was frequently ill, suffering from what was likely severe depression and chronic physical ailments. She spent much of Hetty's childhood bedridden, distant, unavailable. Her father was obsessed with business, obsessed with numbers, obsessed with making more money, even though he already had more than most men would earn in 10 lifetimes. He was stern, calculating, emotionally unavailable. He didn't show affection through hugs or kind words. He showed it, if you can call it that, through financial lessons. And so, Hetty, as a young girl, learned to read financial newspapers instead of fairy tales. While other girls her age were playing with dolls, Hetty was sitting in her father's office, listening to him discuss stock prices, interest rates, and business deals. By the time she was 6 years old, she was reading the financial pages of the newspaper to her nearly blind grandfather. 6 years old, reading stock quotes. Think about that for a moment. What does that do to a child? When your childhood play is replaced with calculations? when love is expressed through balance sheets rather than bedtime stories. Friends who knew the family later recalled that Hetty was never allowed to be a child. She wore plain, dark dresses, never the elaborate, colourful clothes that other wealthy girls wore. Her father believed in frugality despite his wealth. He believed that money should be saved, invested, grown, never wasted on frivolous things like fashionable clothing or toys. Hetty, one family acquaintance later wrote, always seemed like a tiny adult in a child's body. She never laughed the way other children laughed. She never played the way other children played. She was always watching, always calculating, always serious. By age 13, Hetty was managing her own bank account. She would later claim she'd learned bookkeeping before she learned to play. And perhaps most tellingly, she learned early that the people around her, even family, couldn't be trusted when money was involved. Her mother's side of the family, the Howlands, were also immensely wealthy. Her grandfather, Gideon Howland, known as Black Hawk, was worth over $2 million by the 1840s. When he died in 1847, young Hetty watched as her relatives fought viciously over the inheritance. Lawsuits, accusations. Family members who had smiled at each other across Thanksgiving tables now hiring lawyers to destroy each other in court. What must that do to a 13-year-old? Watching adults tear each other apart over money? Seeing that wealth didn't bring family together, it ripped them into pieces? And then there was her aunt, Sylvia Ann Howland. Sylvia was Gideon's daughter, Hetty's mother's sister, and she was wealthy in her own right. But she was also unmarried, childless, and as Hetty grew into her teenage years, there was an unspoken understanding. Sylvia's fortune would eventually go to Hetty, but Sylvia was also mean, controlling, manipulative. She would give Hetty gifts, then use them as leverage. She would promise money, then threaten to change her will if Hetty didn't behave exactly as Sylvia wanted. Hetty spent years, essentially serving as Sylvia's companion, living with her, caring for her, all while knowing that her inheritance depended on pleasing this difficult, demanding woman. It was a transaction, not love, not family, a transaction. By the time Hetty was 20 years old, her personality had been forged in this crucible of wealth without warmth, money without love, family ties that were really just financial contracts waiting to be broken. She had learned that money was the only thing that mattered, that people would betray you for it, that family members would destroy each other for it, and that the only way to be safe was to have more of it than anyone else, and never, ever let it go. But Hetty didn't inherit her fortune as a young woman. First, she would have to wait, and watch, and plan. Because between her and the money stood other people, and Hetty was learning that when money was involved, other people were obstacles. In 1860, when Hetty was 26 years old, her mother Abby died. Hetty had spent years caring for her invalid mother, and now that care would be rewarded, or so she thought. Edward Robinson, Hetty's father, had always been clear about his plans. Hetty would inherit. She was his only child, his heir. But when Abby's will was read, Hetty discovered something that would fuel her paranoia for the rest of her life. Her mother had left her only about $8,000 in cash and some personal items. The bulk of Abby's estate, over $100,000, went into a trust. Hetty would receive the income from the trust, but she couldn't touch the principal. Why? Because Edward didn't trust his daughter to manage money? No, because he wanted control. Even from beyond the grave, through legal structures and trusts, Edward Robinson wanted to control how money flowed. Hetty was furious. Here she was, a woman who'd been reading financial papers since age 6, who understood compound interest better than most bankers, and her own father was treating her like an incompetent child. But she didn't have to wait long. In 1865, Edward Robinson died, and this time, Hetty inherited directly. Her father's estate was worth approximately $5 million, roughly $85 million in today's money. Finally, at age 30, Hetty was wealthy in her own right. But she still wasn't satisfied, because there was still Aunt Sylvia. Sylvia Ann Howland was now in her 70s, still wealthy, still controlling, and still dangling her fortune in front of Hetty like a carrot in front of a horse. Hetty had spent years, literally years, living with Sylvia, caring for her, enduring her moods and demands, all for this moment. When Sylvia died in 1865, just months after Edward Robinson, Hetty rushed to the lawyer's office for the reading of the will. This was it. This was the payoff for all those years of servitude. And then she heard the terms. Sylvia had left Hetty approximately $65,000 outright and income from a trust fund. But the bulk of Sylvia's estate, over $2 million, would go to various charities and distant relatives after certain conditions were met. Hetty couldn't believe it, couldn't accept it. She had sacrificed years of her life for this woman. She had endured. She had served. And this was her reward. A fraction. But then Hetty remembered something. Years earlier, Sylvia had shown her a different will, an earlier will, one that left everything to Hetty directly, with no trusts, no conditions, no charities. Hetty claimed that will was the real one. The most recent will, she insisted, was invalid. Sylvia had been senile. She'd been manipulated by relatives who wanted the money for themselves. The earlier will was Sylvia's true intention. And so began one of the most famous legal battles of the 19th century, Robinson versus Mandel. Hetty produced the earlier will. It was dated 1862, and it clearly stated that Hetty would inherit everything. But there was a problem. Well, several problems. First, the will looked suspicious. The handwriting seemed inconsistent. The signatures seemed traced. And there was a second page, an addition to the will, that was even more suspicious. It looked like someone had copied Sylvia's signature multiple times to make it look authentic. The executors of Sylvia's estate accused Hetty of forgery. They claimed she had taken the genuine 1862 will and added a second page to invalidate any future wills Sylvia might write. The trial was sensational. It dragged on for years. Handwriting experts were called. The signatures were examined under magnifying glasses. Witnesses testified about Sylvia's mental state in her final years. And Hetty? Hetty fought with everything she had. She hired the best lawyers. She gave testimony herself, cool and calculating, insisting that she was the victim here, that her relatives were trying to steal what was rightfully hers. But here's what's truly revealing about Hetty's character. Even as she fought this legal battle, even as she claimed she was fighting for justice and her aunt's true wishes, there's substantial evidence that Hetty did forge that second page. Multiple experts concluded the signatures were traced. People who knew Sylvia testified that the language in the edition didn't sound like her. And most damningly, Hetty herself behaved like someone who knew she'd done something wrong. When the case looked like it was going badly, Hetty did something extraordinary. She fled. In 1868, she left the country entirely, moving to London for several years to avoid potential criminal prosecution for forgery. Think about that. Hetty was already worth over $5 million. She was already one of the wealthiest women in America. She didn't need Sylvia's money to live comfortably. She didn't need it to live luxuriously. She could have accepted the $65,000 and the trust income and still lived like a queen. But she couldn't let it go. She couldn't accept that money she believed was rightfully hers was going to anyone else. The obsession with money wasn't about having enough. It was about having it all, about not losing a single dollar that might be hers. Eventually, in 1871, a settlement was reached. Hetty would receive approximately $600,000 from Sylvia's estate, far less than the full $2 million she'd fought for, but far more than she would have gotten if she'd been convicted of forgery. She returned to America, her reputation damaged, but her bank account larger. And she had learned the most important lesson of her life. Money was worth fighting for. Money was worth lying for. Money was worth destroying relationships for. Money was worth risking prison for. Because in the end, money was the only thing that couldn't betray you, as long as you never let it go. In 1867, while living in London to avoid the forgery scandal, Hetty did something that shocked everyone who knew her. She got married. Edward Henry Greene was a wealthy businessman from Vermont. He was involved in silk importing and trade with the Philippines. Handsome, charming, sociable. In every way, Edward was Hetty's opposite. Where she was cold and calculating, he was warm and friendly. Where she was frugal to the point of pathology, he enjoyed spending money, hosting parties, living well. Why did they marry? For Hetty, the calculation was clear. Edward was wealthy enough that he didn't need her money. He had his own fortune, estimated at about $1 million. He signed a prenuptial agreement stating that their finances would remain completely separate. Hetty would control her money. Edward would control his. No community property. No shared accounts. For Edward, the attraction was probably simpler. Hetty was the richest unmarried woman in America. The prenup protected her money, but being married to Hetty Robinson meant being connected to one of the most powerful financial names in the country. They married on July 11th, 1867, at the home of her guardian in New York. Hetty wore a plain dress, not white, not elaborate, just practical. There was no grand reception, no honeymoon to Europe. They simply returned to Hetty's rented rooms and continued their lives. In 1868, their first child was born, Edward Howland Robinson, Ned Greene. 2 years later, in 1870, their daughter Henrietta, Hetty Sylvia, Howland Greene arrived. For a brief moment, there were people who thought marriage and motherhood might soften Hetty, that having children might unlock some warmth in her that had been frozen since childhood. They were wrong. Hetty loved her children, in her way. But her way was twisted by her obsession with money. She didn't see her children as people to nurture and guide into independent adults. She saw them as extensions of her fortune, as vessels to carry her wealth into the next generation, as pieces on the chessboard of her financial empire. And so Ned and Sylvia grew up in a childhood that was, in many ways, even stranger than their mothers had been. Because at least Hetty had been raised in a mansion. Her children would be raised in boarding houses and cheap apartments, despite their mother's millions. By the 1870s, Hetty Greene's fortune was growing exponentially. She had inherited approximately $7.5 million, combining her father's estate and the settlement from Sylvia's will. That's roughly $175 million in today's dollars. But Hetty didn't just sit on that money. She invested it brilliantly. She focused on conservative investments, government bonds, mortgages, real estate, railroads. During the panic of 1873, when banks were failing and businesses were collapsing, Hetty had cash, lots of cash. And she swooped in like a vulture, buying distressed properties and businesses for pennies on the dollar. She would lend money at high interest rates to desperate businessmen. She would buy foreclosed mortgages and evict families who couldn't pay. She would purchase failed railroad companies, reorganize them, and sell them for enormous profits. Her financial strategy was brilliant, ruthless, but brilliant. By the 1890s, her wealth had grown to over $100 million, making her not just the richest woman in America, but one of the richest people in the entire country, male or female. She could have lived like a Vanderbilt, like an Astor, like a Rockefeller. She could have built mansions that rivaled European palaces. She could have worn gowns from Paris. She could have collected art, traveled the world, lived in luxury beyond most people's wildest dreams. Instead, Hetty Greene chose to live like a pauper. She refused to rent an apartment in her own name, instead staying in cheap boarding houses and continually moving to avoid establishing legal residence in any state, which would have made her liable for state taxes. She would arrive at a boarding house, negotiate the lowest possible rate, then leave before tax assessors could catch up with her. She wore the same black dress for years at a time. When it became too dirty, she would wash only the hem, the part that dragged on the ground and showed dirt most easily, to save on soap and water. The rest of the dress? It would remain unwashed until it was so stiff with grime that it could practically stand up on its own. She carried her lunch with her in a small bag, crackers and raw onions. Why raw? Because cooking them would require fire or gas, and that cost money. When she did eat at restaurants, she would order the cheapest items on the menu, often just a bowl of oatmeal. And if the restaurant tried to charge her for heating it, she would refuse and eat it cold. In her later years, Hetty maintained an office at the Chemical National Bank in Lower Manhattan. It wasn't really an office. It was a corner of the bank's lobby where she would sit on the floor, surrounded by her papers and documents, conducting her business transactions. The bank allowed this because Hetty kept enormous deposits there. She was too valuable a customer to refuse, even if she refused to pay for a proper office space. Imagine that scene. One of the richest people in America, sitting on the floor of a bank lobby, wearing a filthy black dress, eating crackers and raw onions, conducting million-dollar deals. People would come to negotiate business with her, well-dressed bankers and businessmen in fine suits. And there would be Hetty, looking like a homeless woman, offering to lend them hundreds of thousands of dollars at steep interest rates. But the real tragedy of Hetty's cheapness wasn't how it affected her own life. It was how it affected her children. Ned Greene was born into extraordinary wealth. His mother was worth millions. He should have grown up in comfort, with the best education, the best medical care, the best of everything. Instead, he grew up moving from boarding house to boarding house, wearing old clothes, eating cheap food, and learning from his mother that spending money on anything at all, was a moral failure. When Ned was about 14 years old, the exact date is disputed, but it was around 1882, he injured his knee. The accounts vary on how it happened. Some say he fell while sledding in Central Park. Others say it was a skating accident. What's not disputed is what happened next. The knee became infected. Ned was in pain. The wound wasn't healing properly. It was getting worse, showing signs of osteomyelitis, a serious bone infection that required immediate medical attention. Edward Greene, Ned's father, wanted to take the boy to a proper doctor, to pay for the best medical care available. But Hetty refused. She had her reasons in her twisted logic. She believed that doctors were all charlatans who charged outrageous fees for simple treatments. She believed she could treat the knee herself with home remedies and poultices. Instead of taking Ned to a reputable doctor and paying their fees, Hetty dressed herself and Ned in ragged clothes and went to charity clinics. Free clinics meant for the poor. She tried to pass herself off as an impoverished woman who couldn't afford medical care. Think about that. A woman worth millions pretending to be destitute to get free medical care for her child. But the charity clinics eventually recognized her. Word got around. That's Hetty Greene, the millionaire. And they refused to treat Ned for free. They told her to pay like anyone else with money. Hetty's response? She took Ned home and continued trying to treat him herself. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. Ned's leg got worse. The infection spread. The pain became unbearable. Finally, when it became clear that Ned might die from the infection, Hetty relented and took him to a real doctor. But it was too late. The infection had progressed too far. The bone was severely damaged. The only option left was amputation. In 1888, when Ned was about 20 years old, his leg was amputated below the knee. Let's be clear about what happened here. Hetty Greene's son lost his leg because she was too cheap to pay for medical care when he first injured his knee. If she had taken him to a doctor immediately, if she had paid for proper treatment, Ned would have kept his leg. But she couldn't do it. She couldn't bring herself to spend the money, and her son paid the price. After the amputation, Ned had a cork prosthetic leg made. Later, he would have multiple prosthetic legs, including one he reportedly had specially designed with a hollow compartment where he could hide liquor, because Ned, understandably, developed a drinking problem. How could he not? How do you process the fact that your mother, one of the richest people in the world, let you lose your leg because she wouldn't pay a doctor? How do you reconcile that kind of betrayal with the word love? Hetty never admitted fault, never expressed regret. In her mind, she had done everything she could. The doctors were incompetent. The infection was unusual. It wasn't her fault. But everyone else knew the truth. And the story of Hetty letting her son's leg rot off rather than pay a doctor became the defining story of her cheapness. It was the story that revealed she wasn't just frugal. She wasn't just careful with money. She was sick. Pathologically, destructively sick. And yet, somehow, Ned still loved her. Or tried to. Years later, after Hetty's death, when Ned was asked about his childhood, he would defend his mother. He would say she did her best, that she loved him in her own way. But he also spent the rest of his life spending money with wild abandon. As if he was trying to make up for every dollar his mother had refused to spend. As if he was trying to prove that money was meant to be used, not hoarded. As if he was trying to heal the wound that never fully closed, the one in his heart, not his leg. By the 1890s, Hetty Greene's reputation was firmly established. She was known as the Witch of Wall Street, a nickname that captured both her financial brilliance and her miserly, almost supernatural cheapness. In the financial world, she was respected, even feared. She had an uncanny ability to predict market movements. During the panic of 1907, when banks were collapsing and fortunes were being wiped out, Hetty Greene provided millions in loans that helped stabilize the banking system. J.P. Morgan himself acknowledged her financial acumen. She would loan money to cities, to railroads, to businesses, always at high interest, always with ironclad guarantees. She never lost money on a bad investment. Never. Her strategy was simple. Be conservative, stay liquid, wait for others to make mistakes, then swoop in. It worked brilliantly. By the early 1900s, estimates put her wealth at over $100 million, equivalent to more than $3 billion today. But while her financial life was a triumph, her personal life was a disaster. Her marriage to Edward Greene had effectively ended by the 1880s. Edward had made some bad investments, losses that, while significant, wouldn't have mattered to a couple worth their combined fortunes. But Hetty saw his losses as unforgivable sins. She blamed him. She refused to help him. And eventually they separated. Edward moved out, living in a series of hotels and clubs. He and Hetty never divorced. That would have required lawyers and money. But they barely spoke. When Edward died in 1902, Hetty didn't attend his funeral. Her daughter Sylvia remained unmarried for decades, living with her mother, having no real life of her own. Friends later said that Sylvia was terrified of leaving Hetty alone, not out of love, but out of some twisted sense of obligation mixed with fear of being written out of the will. And Hetty herself became increasingly paranoid. She believed everyone was trying to cheat her, steal from her, take advantage of her. She would count pennies multiple times. She would read every document related to her finances, sometimes staying up all night checking and rechecking numbers. She feuded with relatives, with former business partners, with anyone who she felt had wronged her financially. She was involved in countless lawsuits, always over money, always fighting to get every last cent she believed was owed to her. People who encountered her on the streets of New York, and she was hard to miss, with her filthy black dress and bag of crackers, would cross to the other side to avoid her. Not because they feared her financially, but because she radiated something unsettling, an aura of obsession, of anger, of a life consumed by a single, all-devouring focus. Hetty Greene had become exactly what she feared most. She had become like her family, like the relatives who had fought over her grandfather's will. Like her Aunt Sylvia, who had manipulated her for years. She had become someone who saw every human relationship through the lens of money, who trusted no one, who measured life in dollars and cents rather than moments and connections. The woman who had everything had nothing that mattered. On July 3rd, 1916, Hetty Greene died. She was 81 years old. The cause of death was apoplexy, a stroke brought on by a fit of anger during an argument. What was the argument about? Money, of course. She had been fighting with a cook over the cost of food. Even in her final moments, Hetty Greene couldn't let go of her obsession. She died as she lived, angry about money, fighting over pennies, unable to simply let a single dollar slip through her fingers. She died in her son Ned's home in New York. Not in a mansion, not surrounded by luxury, but in a modest house, wearing her same old black dress, her financial papers scattered around her as they had been for decades. When her will was read, people discovered that Hetty Greene's estate was worth approximately $100 million, $200 million according to some estimates. In today's dollars, that's anywhere from $2.5 billion to $5 billion. She left it all to her two children, Ned and Sylvia. Everything she had hoarded, everything she had fought for, everything she had sacrificed her relationships and her health and her son's leg for, it all went to them. And what did Ned and Sylvia do with it? They spent it. They spent it with enthusiasm and joy and absolute abandon. Ned Greene became one of the most flamboyant spenders in America. He collected cars, dozens of them. He bought estates. He dated showgirls and actresses. He threw lavish parties. He installed diamond-studded dashboards in his cars. He purchased an entire island, Round Island in Massachusetts, and built a lavish summer retreat there. Did he waste the money? By his mother's standards, absolutely. By the standards of someone who had lost his leg because his mother wouldn't spend money on doctors. He was finally free. Sylvia also married, finally, at age 51, 6 years after her mother's death. She married a man named Matthew Astor Wilkes from a lesser branch of the Astor family and spent her final years living comfortably, quietly, without the shadow of her mother's obsession hanging over her. Both children died in the 1930s, having spent a significant portion of their inheritance. The money Hetty had guarded so jealously that she had sacrificed everything for, dissipated within a generation. And in a way, isn't that the ultimate irony? Hetty spent her entire life trying to accumulate and protect wealth. She believed money was the only thing that mattered, the only thing that lasted. But money doesn't last. Not really. It flows, it moves, it changes hands. The fortune she built was spent. The empire she created crumbled. The only thing that truly lasted was the story, the cautionary tale of a woman who had everything and nothing all at once. So what made Hetty Greene the way she was? How does someone with $100 million live like they're destitute? How does a mother let her son lose his leg rather than pay for medical care? The easy answer is that she was simply mentally ill, that she suffered from some form of pathological hoarding disorder, combined with paranoia and perhaps other psychological conditions. And there's truth to that. By any modern psychiatric standard, Hetty Greene was deeply, seriously unwell. But it's not quite that simple. Hetty's pathology was forged in her childhood. She grew up in a world where money was the language of love, or the absence of love. Her father showed approval through financial lessons, not affection. Her mother was absent, physically and emotionally. Her extended family demonstrated that money turned people into enemies. She learned early that money was the only reliable thing in a world of uncertainty. People would betray you. Family would fight over inheritance. Husbands might try to steal from you, but money, if you held onto it tightly enough, couldn't leave you. Her experiences with her Aunt Sylvia and the inheritance battle reinforced this worldview. She had given years of her life to Sylvia, and what did she get? A fraction of what she believed she deserved. The lesson: people will always try to cheat you. The only protection is to fight for every penny. And there's another dimension: control. For Hetty, money wasn't just about wealth. It was about control in a world where she had very little control as a woman in the 19th century. Despite her brilliance, despite her financial acumen, Hetty lived in an era when women couldn't vote, when married women had limited property rights, when society expected women to be decorative and submissive. Money was the one arena where Hetty could exercise power, where she could make men respect her, even if they didn't like her, where she could say no and make it stick. But that control came at a cost. It required constant vigilance, constant fighting, constant suspicion of everyone around her. And eventually, the vigilance became the entire point. Accumulating money stopped being about security and became an addiction, an obsession, a pathology. Hetty Greene was terrified. Terrified of being cheated. Terrified of losing control. Terrified of ending up dependent on others. And so she built walls of money around herself. But walls that are meant to keep threats out also keep connection out. In trying to protect herself from being hurt, Hetty Greene ensured that she would be isolated, suspicious, and alone for her entire life. She was the richest woman in America, and she was utterly, completely impoverished in every way that actually matters. Hetty Greene has been dead for over a century now. Her fortune is gone. Her children are gone. The houses she refused to buy, the clothes she refused to wear, the doctors she refused to pay. All of it is ancient history. But the story of Hetty Greene persists. Why? Because she represents something that fascinates and terrifies us in equal measure. She represents the dark side of the American dream. we're told that accumulating wealth is good, that financial success is the measure of a life well lived. But Hetty Greene shows us what happens when that pursuit becomes everything. When the accumulation of wealth stops being a means to an end and becomes the end itself. She made over $100 million. And what did she buy with it? Nothing. Nothing but misery, isolation, and the loss of her son's leg. In our own era, when we're constantly bombarded with messages about financial success, about building wealth, about securing our financial futures, Hetty Greene stands as a warning. Money is a tool. It's meant to be used. It's meant to serve life, not replace it. Hetty Greene's story also reveals uncomfortable truths about how childhood trauma shapes our adult lives. She grew up without emotional warmth, without security despite wealth, without trust in the people who should have loved her unconditionally. And she spent the rest of her life trying to create security through money, never realizing that the security she craved couldn't be bought. There's also a gender dimension to Hetty's story that's worth considering. As a woman in the 19th century, she faced constraints and prejudices that her male counterparts didn't. The fact that she succeeded as brilliantly as she did in the male-dominated world of finance is remarkable. But the price she paid, becoming more ruthless, more miserly, more isolated than any of the men she dealt with, raises questions about what society demanded of women who wanted power in that era. Would a man with Hetty's financial brilliance have been celebrated as a genius rather than mocked as a witch? Probably. Would a man who lived frugally despite vast wealth have been praised for his discipline rather than ridiculed for his cheapness? Possibly. The double standards she faced may have pushed her to extremes that a man in her position wouldn't have felt necessary. But here's the thing. Regardless of the psychological explanations, regardless of the gender dynamics, regardless of all the contextual factors that shaped her life, Hetty Greene made choices. She chose to let her son lose his leg. She chose to live in squalor. She chose isolation over connection. She chose money over people, again and again and again. And those choices had consequences, not just for her, but for everyone around her. So what can we take away from the life of Hetty Greene? First, money is a terrible master, but a useful servant. When money becomes the point of life, rather than a tool to support life, you've already lost. Hetty made over $100 million and lived like she had nothing. That's not financial genius. That's a failure to understand what money is for. Second, childhood wounds, left unhealed, can poison an entire life. Hetty never dealt with the emotional deprivation of her childhood, the trust issues created by her family's behavior, the lessons she learned about money being more reliable than people. Instead, she let those wounds fester and ultimately define her entire existence. Third, you can't take it with you, and even while you're here, hoarding it makes you poorer, not richer. Hetty died with $100 million and no one who truly loved her. Her children spent her fortune and probably felt more relief than grief at her passing. What kind of legacy is that? Fourth, the obsessive pursuit of security can create the very insecurity it's meant to prevent. Hetty's paranoia and cheapness didn't make her safe. They made her a target of mockery, isolated her from genuine relationships, and ensured that her final years were spent in anger and suspicion. And finally, wealth without wisdom is worthless. Hetty was brilliant at making money. Absolutely brilliant. But she was utterly clueless about how to live. And in the end, the living is what matters. If you're struggling with your own relationship with money, Hetty Greene's story offers a dark mirror. Are you saving for genuine security, or because spending makes you anxious? Are you building wealth to support a life you want to live, Or has accumulating wealth become the point of living? Are you so afraid of being taken advantage of that you're closing yourself off from genuine connection? These are hard questions, but they're worth asking. Because the alternative is to end up like Hetty Greene, dying angry over the price of groceries, wearing a dress so filthy it can stand up on its own, surrounded by financial documents, but utterly alone. Hetty Greene was the richest woman in America, and she was one of the poorest human beings who ever lived. Don't be Hetty Greene. There's a postscript to Hetty Greene's story that's worth sharing. After her death, as her estate was being settled, workers cleaning out her various storage spaces and bank vaults made a discovery. Hetty had hidden money everywhere, not just in accounts and investments, but physically. Cash sewn into her clothes, bonds hidden in books, securities stuffed into random boxes. They found approximately $31 million in negotiable securities that Hetty had apparently forgotten about. Just forgotten. $31 million that did her no good, that she never used, that she literally didn't even remember existed. Think about that. She lived in squalor. She let her son lose his leg. She wore rags. She ate cold oatmeal. And she had $31 million hidden away that she'd forgotten about. If that doesn't perfectly capture the madness of her relationship with money, nothing does. Hetty Greene didn't just accumulate wealth. She accumulated symbols of wealth, pieces of paper representing money, and then didn't even remember she had them. The hoarding was the point, not the having, not the using, just the hoarding. Today, if you visit the financial district in New York, you can walk past the location where the Chemical National Bank once stood, where Hetty sat on the floor conducting her business. There's a different building there now. The bank is long gone. The fortune is long spent. The empire is dust. But the story remains. The cautionary tale. The warning. The ghost story about a different kind of ghost. The ghost of a living woman who was already dead inside, haunted not by the past, but by a fear of the future that consumed her present. They called her the Witch of Wall Street. But she wasn't a witch. She was something sadder and more human than that. She was a person who had everything and nothing all at once. A person who won every financial battle and lost the war of life itself. She was Hetty Greene, the richest woman in America, the poorest soul in New York. May we all learn from her mistakes, and may we all have the wisdom she lacked. The wisdom to know that the best investment you can make is in the life you're living right now, not the security you think you'll need someday. Because someday, like Hetty discovered, you run out of days, and all the money in the world can't buy you one more. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories about the strange, tragic, and extraordinary lives of history's most unforgettable characters.